UFC 300 is a mess, is one of the biggest failures of UFC.
No! God, please, no! No! No!
And UFC 300 just ruined UFC 301 in Brazil. On this video, I will explain why I think like that. Stay tuned. UFC 300 was supposed to be this big card like UFC 100, like UFC 200. The biggest thing in UFC 300 may be Jim Miller, brother, because he fought on 100 and he fought on 200 and now he will fight on 300. But UFC 300 is just a mess and I'm going to tell you why. It's a good card, but it's not 300 worth. Why are you saying that, Moicano? Because the expectations of UFC 300, it was a big thing everybody was talking about. Dana White was saying on some clips and some videos, like, you're not gonna believe what I have for the main event, you're not gonna believe this card is crazy. So the expectation was very high. In my opinion, should be a name like Conor McGregor, Jon Jones, or even Khabib Nurmagomedov. Some people were talking about Khabib leaving retirement and doing one more fight. And I was believing that.
Don't make a headline out of anything these days, huh? It's ridiculous.
I thought Khabib could return. And I know that's not a factual thing. I know that's going to be very hard. That was supposed to be very hard. But this is UFC 300. UFC could offer millions of dollars. But unfortunately, Khabib is not fighting. And Jon Jones, UFC reached out to him, but I don't know why he didn't accept the fight. And Conor McGregor, obvious, I don't know what's going on with Conor McGregor. And in my opinion, Conor McGregor should be the main event, but not against Michael Chandler. Listen to me. We don't know when Conor McGregor is fighting, but for UFC 300, Conor versus Chandler, that's not an option for me, you know? They should put Conor against Charles Oliveira. I think that fight should be the main event of UFC 300. Do you agree with that? Charles, former champion, he is still a matchup that I think he would be favored against McGregor, but McGregor still has a shot against Charles Oliveira. Charles Oliveira very popular, Conor McGregor very popular. They went back and forth on Twitter and stuff. And to be honest with you, I don't think people are interested enough in Chandler versus Conor, and that's why the fight is not happening on UFC 300. I don't know, I should not be talking about that on UFC 300 video, but talking in McGregor, you have to talk about Chandler, and Chandler is just humiliating himself to get the fight against Conor McGregor. Yesterday, he was on WWE screaming to get a fight against Conor McGregor.
Conor McGregor, get your candy ass back to the octagon!
Just stop it, my brother. Conor McGregor is playing games with you. So it's sad to see an athlete like Chandler doing that. You know, I know it's a special fight. I know it's a money fight. But man, maybe you're worth more than that, okay? So let's move on to UFC 300. Conor McGregor is not fighting. Chandler McGregor is not worth it. And again, McGregor versus Charles Oliveira, that should be a main event. But they could not got in an agreement. So before talk about the main event of UFC 300, I have to talk about the whole lead up to the UFC 300. And I think Dana White and the UFC, they were too worried about to hype up the card, and they actually were not thinking about the other cards, because UFC 298 was great. We have a new champion, Topuria. He just smoked Volkanovski, and that was a crazy card. That was a very good card. Like I say, the main event could easily be the main event in UFC 300, in my opinion, especially now with Topuria this big. He could be on UFC 300 today, right? But at the same time, UFC 299 is a crazy show in Miami. Man, UFC 299, I think is better than UFC 300. What do you guys think? Do you think 299 is better than 300? Doesn't matter what. 298 and 299, they were great cards, so people still were expecting a main event, UFC 300, crazy. So I think Dana White knew that. He hyped up the show so much, UFC 300, that he was trying to get a good main event. So he could not find Jon Jones, he could not find McGregor. Khabib was not all about the business. So they try to reach out. So they hype up the show, and Dana White was talking about that, how crazy it was to put that thing on order, on place, and they tried to use Leon Edwards. We just saw what Leon Edwards said, like they offered him 3 opponents. First one was Shavkat Rakhmonov. I think that fight makes sense. I think he should fight for the title. But let me tell you something, no disrespect to Rakhmonov and to Leon Edwards, but that's not UFC 300 main event worth it. And everybody knows that. But at this point, UFC is crazy. They have to do something. Everybody's talking about the show. Everybody talk about who is the main event. They offer Rakhmonov. I don't know why Rakhmonov didn't accept. Leon Edwards accepted. Big points to him because this is a tough opponent. But again, even if they make that fight, I didn't want to pay to watch the fight on UFC 300. Another fight they offered Leon Edwards was Chimaev, Khamzat Chimaev. In my opinion, that's 100% main event worth of UFC 300. I would rather watch Leon Edwards and Chimaev than Hill and Pereira, and I'm going to talk about that in a minute. Chimaev, like you or not, he's a big star. He's a household name in UFC. He sells a lot of tickets, and like you, Leon Edwards or not, he beat Usman. I don't think he's the more entertaining fighter, but this fight against Chimaev for the title, I think that would be great for UFC 300 main event. They could not get into the agreement. And the last fight that was offered to Leon Edwards was Islam Makhachev. And in my opinion, that's UFC 300 main event worth it. Because Makhachev, 55, he's beating up everybody on the 155. He beat up Volkanovski on the first round. He's smoking him. So dominant champion. He has a shot against Leon Edwards because the wrestling. So that's a fight like 2 big names. I think that's main event worth it, especially because it's like a double champ status. So I think that would be a good main event, but still they could not get to an agreement on that. They tried to save the show with these fights, but they couldn't get a deal. Then we got in the main event that we have now, Alex Pereira versus Jamahal Hill. And I think that fight makes sense on the 205, but to be the main event of UFC 300, I personally don't like. Alex Pereira is one of my favorite fighters to watch. I love watching him fighting, but he's not a complete martial arts yet. He still needs to work on his takedown defense, on the takedown offensive. Let's be real. He is one of the best kickboxers in the world, but talking about MMA, he still do mistakes like he did on Proracha fight. He pulled a guillotine, and imagine if that against a wrestler. Jamahal Hill is not a wrestler, and I never saw Jamahal Hill shooting for takedowns. So that fight is going to be a striking match for sure, and that's exciting because the fight will be good, but I don't think Alex Pereira is a superstar worldwide. He's not a guy like Chimaev. Chimaev is not even champion, you know? So I think Alex Pereira has everything to be that star, you know, champion in 2 divisions, but he's still new to the sport. He still don't represent the name of MMA. I think people still see him and see kickboxing, if you understand me, you know. When you see Alex Pereira, you don't say MMA, you say striking, you know. And UFC 300 is all about MMA, brother. Almost 30 years UFC is running the MMA scene, so I don't know. Still, I think he could be. Imagine if Alex Pereira learning English, he would be an even bigger star because everybody loves him. He's showing a little bit more his persona, his character. So eventually, if he keeps winning, he's going to be a superstar worldwide. But I don't think he is right now. I could be wrong. Let me know what do you think about that. I could be wrong. And on the other hand, you have Jamahal Hill, former champion, but his best win was against Glover Teixeira. And after that, he retired, so he was old. And he's not a superstar, like a huge name. So I don't like the matchup for UFC 300. Like I say, for the 205 title in another pay-per-view event. Even on UFC 301, that would be crazy. And my last point over here, if you agree with everything that I say, let me know in the comments right now. If you disagree. But my problem with UFC 300 is they put so better fights in UFC 298 and UFC 299, and then something was missing in UFC 300. In UFC 300, they did a mistake because UFC 301 is going to be in Brazil, and they got the most popular fighters on Brazil. So you have Alex Pereira and you have Charles do Bronx to fight UFC 300. So what about UFC 301? Charles Oliveira was supposed to be over there because probably he's the biggest name in Brazilian MMA right now, even bigger than Alex Pereira in my opinion, even though he's not champion anymore. People love Charles Oliveira, and Alex Pereira defending his title in Brazil, that would be crazy. But again, like, because the whole situation, because the whole build up, UFC 298, 299, they had to put Alex Pereira on the main event of UFC 300, and now we don't have a main event for UFC 301. And even though Pantoja is my friend and he is the champion, and most likely he will be the main event of UFC 301, I would rather to be Alex Pereira and Jamahal Hill on 301, right? And Charles Oliveira as the main event against Sarukian in Brazil, that would be crazy. But they were trying to hype up the UFC 300. So UFC 300 make this big mess on UFC. It's not a main event worth it. Ruin 301, and still there is one more fight to announce on UFC 300, and I'm waiting. Let's see if that fight can save the show. That was the video for today. That's my opinion. I think they should think a little bit more about UFC 301. I think they should manage the fights better, you know, because 299 is stacked, very good cards. I want to watch a lot. Dustin Poirier versus Benoit Saint-Denis. Even fights like Kevin Holland and Michael Venom Page, are you kidding me? That on UFC 300 would be crazy. And I think they run out of options. They try to glue the stuff with Jamahal Hill and Alex Pereira, and I personally don't like, even though I am a huge fan of Alex Pereira, and that ruined UFC 301. That was the video for today. I don't know if you agree with me or not, but you know what? You, my friend, if you don't agree. Peace out.